To help with that, to help provide those kinds of relationships, we one of the highlights of the program is a summer residency where we place you with one of the districts that we worked with in the past. So if you are a first year or second year doctoral student, or if you know of a first year or second year doctoral student who might be interested in this kind of thing, please go to the PIER program website. The deadline is not until March 31st, but so encourage, if you know of anybody who'd be interested in the fellowship, please encourage them to apply. Okay.
Yes, and the application does, sorry, I was just going to say the application does involve some referral letters. So please do let your faculty referrals know as soon as possible so they have that time too. So sorry, Tom, thanks.
Okay, so this session is being recorded, so please keep that in mind when you ask questions. I also wanted to just share a few other expectations for the event. We encourage you to ask clarifying questions throughout the presentation, but please save more in-depth questions till the end. I'll be keeping an eye on the chat. If you have a clarifying question, just pop it into the chat, and if Barbara doesn't notice it, I'll raise it. But then we'll have hopefully a more open discussion at the end. If you're viewing this via YouTube, submit questions on Twitter at #PIERseminar or email PIER_fellowship@gse.harvard.edu. So with that out of the way, I just wanted to extend a warm welcome to Barbara Biasi. Barbara is joining us from Rome, hence the change in timing today. She's 6 hours, I think 6 hours ahead of us.
Yes.
And so Barbara, when she's not in Rome, is an assistant professor of economics at the Yale School of Management. Her research focuses in the areas of labor economics and applied microeconomics with a focus on education and innovation. Her recent research has been investigating the effects of changes in teacher compensation on teachers' labor markets and on the effects of school finance equalization on long-run children's outcomes, so intergenerational mobility. Today, Barbara is going to be talking to us about a study she has done with Song Ma on using course syllabi, and they'll be presenting some novel measures of just the degree to which a course syllabus is near the knowledge frontier. So in any case, welcome, Barbara. Thanks for joining us, especially all the way from Rome.
Thanks for the introduction, Tom, and for virtually hosting me at Harvard GSE. I'm very happy to be here. The title of this presentation and this project is the Education Innovation Gap, and as Tom mentioned, this is joint work with Song Ma, who's my colleague at Yale School of Management. And the broad motivation for this project is the consideration that ideas and knowledge are key for technological progress and economic growth. And because they're so important, we think it makes sense to understand how knowledge is produced, but also disseminated throughout the economy and how it arrives to the people that then are gonna produce innovation. A key role in this process is that of higher education programs, not only as producers, but also in particular as disseminators of knowledge. However, we know from an extensive literature on higher education that there are a lot of differences across programs in the type of education that they're able to provide to the students, in the returns that they generate, and also more broadly in the characteristics of the students that attend them. A very recent piece of evidence has shown that, for example, most inventors in America end up graduating from a very small subset of schools, which seems to suggest that perhaps there are differences across programs, not just across, but also within schools, in the extent to which they are able to equip students with the particular knowledge that is important to innovate and generate growth. And in this project, we want to exactly quantify this dimension of heterogeneity across not just higher education programs, but actually we're going to go at an even finer level and look at higher education courses. The research question of this project is, to what extent does higher education equip students with what we're going to call frontier knowledge? And I'm going to define that in just a few seconds. But you should think of it as the type of knowledge that is particularly important for innovation. We're going to do this using a new source of data, which is going to be the text of a few million course syllabi from a variety of higher education institutions in the United States. We're going to use this text to construct a new measure, which we are going to call the education innovation gap, which I'm going to describe. I'm going to spend most of my time describing it. But the kind of intuition behind this measure is that of quantifying the extent to which the knowledge that gets taught in a particular course is up to date with respect to the research frontier, to the knowledge frontier. So what are we going to do specifically in the paper? We're going to define this measure and we're going to construct it. And I'm going to give you more details on that. And we're also going to validate it. So we're going to do a number of exercises to make sure that this measure is indeed capturing what we want it to capture. The approach, again, is going to be a text as data approach. And in particular, our measure is going to consist in the relative similarity of the content of a syllabus with academic papers published many years prior to the syllabus over academic papers published the year prior to when the syllabus was taught. So intuitively, a syllabus is going to, or a course is going to have a larger gap if it is more similar to older knowledge, that is to knowledge that was produced many years prior, than it is to newer one. Okay, once we construct this measure, as I said, we're going to try to validate it. And in particular, we have a couple of tests that we think are pretty convincing in making us sure that our measure is capturing indeed this distance. We're going to find in particular that the gap correlates with the average age of papers and books that are listed in a given syllabus as required or recommended readings. This implies that a course that requires students to read older papers and books is also going to have a larger gap. We're also going to do a simulation exercise where in a sample of our syllabi, we're going to mechanically change the words of the syllabus, kind of replacing words that are more frequently found in older papers with words that are more frequently found in newer papers. And we're going to measure how the gap changes as we do that progressively more and more, as we replace more and more words. And we're going to see that the gap declines, which is, again, I think a convincing exercise to ensure that we are measuring what we want to measure. And then really the bulk of the presentation is going to be about describing how the education innovation gap varies across courses taught in different schools, as well as across courses taught within the same school and to some extent within the same field, but taught by different people. And we're going to use the results of these exercises to learn something about how the content of knowledge that is disseminated through higher education courses is produced and shaped. And in particular, what we're going to find is that if we look at across schools, we're going to see that more selective schools and schools that have more resources, and also, perhaps not surprisingly, schools that serve a lower share of socioeconomically disadvantaged students tend to teach courses with a lower gap. So knowledge is more up to date in schools that are relatively better off. But also when we look at within schools, we're going to find quite a bit of variation. And actually most of the variation is going to be within schools. And we're going to find that instructors play a very big role in shaping the content of higher education. And in particular, what our data seem to indicate is that instructors who are active in research, they publish more, they get cited more, they receive more grants, are also the ones that teach the courses with the lower gap. And then in the last part of the paper, we're going to try to understand, to the extent that we can with the data that we have in this paper, whether these differences that we measure across courses, across and within schools, matter for students. Are they important, or are they just, a feature of education that just happens to be that way, but it doesn't have any consequences on students? And in particular, what we're going to show is that we don't have, a research design that allows us to credibly establish a causal relationship between our measure and various student outcomes. For the sake of this paper, we're working now on this in a different paper. But what we are going to see is that even controlling for a very, very rich set of school level observables, what we see is that schools that have on average a lower higher education innovation gap are going to have a larger share of undergraduate students that attend PhD, that complete PhD programs, a larger share of patents, a larger number of patents produced by the students. Students are going to be more likely to graduate, and they're going to have higher incomes upon graduation. Okay, and then in the very last part of the paper, I don't know if I'm going to have time to talk about this, but we're also going to talk a little bit about different measures of novelty of a course. And in particular, we try to capture the soft skills intensity of courses, and we see patterns that are very similar to the ones that we find for the education innovation gap. Okay, so just very briefly on the contribution to the literature, we are contributing to a literature that has tried to say something about how innovation gets produced. And our contribution here is going to be that of focusing on the knowledge content of each course, as opposed to differences, say, across schools or across fields in the extent to which they're able to generate innovation. The second contribution is going to be to a literature that has tried to, I was hinting to this at the beginning, that has tried to establish heterogeneity in the production of human capital. So, for example, differences across schools by selectivity in the types of, say, earnings or causal effects on students' earnings that they're able to produce. Here, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on, we're going to have a new approach to measure the content of a higher education, as opposed to just distinguishing, by school selectivity or by major or by other sort of more commonly used observable characteristics of programs. We also speak to a relatively recent knowledge on inequalities in access to knowledge. And in particular, we're going to document differences across students with different backgrounds in access to what we call frontier knowledge. And then, this paper, of course, because of its methodology, is related to a host of papers that have used various sources of text as a source of data to conduct quantitative analysis in various contexts, including, for example, using the text of newspapers to measure media slant, or using the text of patents to establish patterns or trends in innovation. All right. Are there any questions?
So Barbara, we're
Yes.
looking for I just told people in the text that you've done us a favor to analyze the syllabi of every person on this call, and we'll be presenting it at the end. So like people
with photos.
Yeah.
Yes, I wish I could, but I actually have promised never to do that to the people that very kindly shared the syllabi with us. But I have to admit that since I've been working on this project, I am much more kind of self-conscious of the papers that I am referencing, or the content that I'm putting into my own courses. So
you've just made us all self-conscious about that.
Okay, so this is going to be a very ambitious outline for the rest of the talk. I'm going to start by describing the data, because that's really our starting point. Then I'm going to describe our measure. And then I'm going to spend most of my time kind of describing how the gap varies both across and within schools, focusing in particular on the role of instructors. And then towards the end of the presentation, I will show you correlations of the gap with the host of student outcomes. And then if I have time, I will also talk about alternative measures of novelty. But I feel like that's okay if we don't get there because of the limited time. Okay, let me start by telling you something about the data that we use in this project. So our starting point is the text of 7 million course syllabi, which we access through Open Syllabus. So Open Syllabus is a big project that was initially hosted at Columbia University in New York. Now it's a separate entity that has, over the years, been collecting essentially all the course syllabi of colleges and universities that they could find through web crawling. For the sake of this paper, we are going to be focusing on syllabi that were taught between 1988 and 2018 in 4-year higher education institutions in the United States. So we're gonna essentially exclude community colleges just for the sake of comparability. We're also gonna adjust our sample a little bit to exclude the extremely long and short documents, but these are very few. But essentially by applying these restrictions in order to have a sample that is sort of comparable over time, we are going to focus our attention on a little less than 2 million syllabi. And these are going to be syllabi of courses taught in nearly 800 institutions in the US. This syllabi, the data, the kind of raw data of the text of the syllabi came to us already classified in 69 fields. This fields classification, we're going to do a couple of kind of data manipulations to then map it to the field classification that, for example, journals and paper repositories typically have. But you should think of this syllabi as covering essentially all fields of courses taught in universities. Okay. So what are we going to take? What type of content are we going to extract from a syllabus? So here on the left part of the slide, I am using my own syllabus of a class I used to teach at Yale SOM titled Inequality and Social Mobility. And I'm going to use that to sort of illustrate what pieces of information we're going to pull out of each syllabus. So the first piece of information is basic information on the course. And this typically includes the course code and the level of the course. The course code allows us to track the same course as it evolves in the same school over time. Whereas the course level basically tells us whether a course is a basic undergraduate course, first 2 years of undergrad, advanced undergraduate, last 2 years, or a graduate course. And we infer that with doing a lot of work on the course syllabi, because usually course codes follow a classification that unfortunately very often differs across schools. And so we had to reconstruct this classification within each school, but we were able to successfully do that for the vast majority of the courses in our sample. So in the case of my course, for example, you can tell that this is a graduate level course, it's an MBA course, by the fact that the course code starts with MGT, which stands for management, which implies that this is a course taught at the School of Management. And at Yale, the School of Management only teaches master's level and PhD courses. Okay. We're also going to pull out information on the name of the instructor. You can see my name here in this professor box. And then we're going to take any information we can find in the syllabus that describes what the course is going to be about. So in the case of my syllabus, I typically have a paragraph on the first page that describes the main topics that are going to be covered in the class. And then as I'm going to show you, I have a page for each class session that goes into a little bit more detail. We're going to use all this textual information to characterize the content of a course. We're also going to pull out whatever we can, and actually we can in the almost totality of our sample, pull out information on the assignments and in sort of the activities the students have to complete to get a grade for that class. And we do this because we want to sort of measure the skills that are trained and tested in that course. So for example, here I have in this page, class participation, discussion leader, a final group project. Those are all things that students in my course needed to do in order to accumulate points, and that would give them the grade for the class. And then the very last piece of information that we're going to use in some analysis is information on the references, the bibliographic references contained in the syllabus. So you can see here that, for example, for each class session, I would briefly describe what the session would be about, and then I would list some papers that are required for kind of optional readings. We're going to collect all this bibliographic information. This table here sort of summarizes our syllabi sample in terms of content, and I will tell you a little bit more on what the number of words and knowledge words means in just a few slides. But you can also see here the breakdown by field and by course level. And in particular, you can see that about 31% of courses in our sample are STEM courses, 11% are business courses, 30% are humanities, and 26% are social science courses. These represent pretty well the typical breakdown of courses in the average university in the United States across all kind of selectivity tiers and private and public. So this sort of breakdown is pretty representative of the type of population of schools that we're looking at. The breakdown in terms of course level is also pretty representative, and you know, we have a couple of figures in the appendix of the paper for those of you who are interested, where we compare the distribution in our sample with the distribution in sort of the population, because we were able to collect the population of courses for a representative sample of schools in our data. So you can see here the breakdown in terms of course level. You can see that a little less than 40% of all of our courses are basic undergraduate courses. We have 20% of courses who are advanced undergraduate. These are junior and senior courses. Here, we're actually slightly underrepresenting advanced undergraduate courses. So there are a little bit more in most schools that we can observe. And then we're fairly balanced in terms of the share of graduate courses. These are master and PhD courses, which represent about a third of the total sample. Okay, so this is the sort of first big piece of data that we're going to use, the data on the syllabi. There's another big chunk of data that we're going to connect to the syllabi, which is data on academic publications. So what we are going to do is we're going to get this information through Scopus, which is a database that contains articles from a host of fields, kind of going back in time as far as it is essentially possible. So what we're going to do is we're going to restrict our attention to what we consider top journals, because we want to capture frontier knowledge. So we're going to capture good knowledge, not just you know, anything that gets published. So what we're going to do is for each field, we're going to rank journals according to impact factor. We're going to take and we're going to consider a journal as top if it ranks in the top 10 at least once since 1975. And so if a journal ranks at least in the top 10 by impact factor in a given field, we're going to collect all the articles that were ever published in that journal, regardless of the year. And this is going to leave us with about 8 million articles, okay? We're going to use information on the title, but most importantly, the abstract, and when they're available, the keywords of the article to be able to kind of concisely capture content. And we're also going to use information on the publication year, because that's going to, you know, allow us to determine where the frontier of knowledge is at a given point in time. The third piece of data that we're going to use is data that we self-collected on the instructors of the courses. And this, remember that we extract the name of the instructor from each syllabus. So what we're going to do is we're going to run the name of the instructor and the name of the institution, in my case, Barbara Biasi at Yale, or here, actually, I have an example of my colleague, through Microsoft Academic, which is a portal that works very similarly as Google Scholar. But instead of just listing kind of published papers, it also lists things like working papers, white papers, policy briefs, or even in some cases patents for the people who patent, together with kind of bibliographic information about these documents and the number of citations to each one of these documents. We are able to find approximately 36% of all of our instructors in Microsoft Academic, which might seem like a worrying number because it might make you think that maybe we're not doing a great job in extracting the name of the instructor and searching for them. But actually what we think it represents is the fact that a lot of our instructors in our data never publish. And we're gonna see, I'm gonna just show you in the next slide that a lot of the instructors in our data are not tenure track or tenured faculty, but are actually non-ladder faculty whose primary job is to teach. So it's not that surprising that a lot of instructors in our sample are just not active from the standpoint of research. Last two pieces of information on the instructors are information on public research funding. What we mean here are large grants. For now, we might think of extending the sample of grants, but for now we're using grants from the National Science Foundation and the National Institute of Health, which are two of the largest public funding agencies in the United States. We're going to use instructors' names and institution information to search through essentially the list of principal investigators across these grants. We're going to see that approximately 11% of all of our instructors receive at least one grant in our time period. And the last piece of data is unfortunately available only for a subsample of our instructors, and in particular, the ones that teach in public schools in certain states, and is data on pay, but most importantly, job title, which comes from state accountability lists. So there's a lot of states, for example, the state of Wisconsin is one of them, the state of California is another one of them, that publish the salaries of public sector employees in universities. And this includes, faculty. And together with salary, they publish typically the job title. So we're not using salary that much for the sake of this project, but we are using the title because this is going to allow us to separate between ladder faculty and non-ladder faculty, and within ladder faculty, tenure track, people on the tenure track, and people who are already tenured. And we're going to look at some differences in the content of the courses that they teach. Okay, this is just a summary of the instructor data. We're going to see here about 36% of instructors ever publish, in the sense that we can find them in Microsoft Academic. You can see a breakdown of the summary statistics of the citations and publications. You can also see at the end the breakdown between ladder and non-ladder, and in fact you see that the sample is pretty split between, at least for instructors for which we have this information, between ladder and non-ladder faculty. And assistant professors in particular, which are the most junior ladder faculty, the untenured ones, represent 13% of our instructors for whom we have job title information. Okay. So I'm seeing that there are some questions in the chat. If Tom or Ashley want to kind of take a look at them, feel free to interrupt me at any time.
Yeah, so Barbara, there have been a couple of questions in the chat about, okay, aren't there some fields like, English or the classics where recency of publication wouldn't necessarily be a good proxy for cutting edge? The cutting edgeness is more about like new research, particularly in science, technology, social science, but in some other fields it may not be as good a match. Or what do you?
Yeah, so I'm gonna tell you in just maybe like a couple of slides how we account for the fact, how we try not to penalize too much courses that rely on classics, because classics presumably are classics because they're high quality. Regarding differences across fields, for sure there are. And all the comparisons that I'm going to show you from now on are going to be within field. So we're always going to control for field exactly because there's so many things that differ across fields. The way, the pace at which knowledge progresses, the frontier progresses, the publication process also differs across fields. So we're never going to be comparing across fields. But I do want to say that even in fields that seem like, fields where maybe people publish less, there's still journals that are publishing kind of new research. That new research might still be studying the classics, but it is maybe, different interpretations of different ways of saying things. And that's what we're trying to capture with our measure. But definitely, the process with which knowledge advances might differ across fields, which is why, we never do the comparison across fields. Thank you. And please, if there are any other questions, especially in the chat, which I have a little bit of a hard time monitoring, feel free to jump in and interrupt.
Yes. And I should have said, like, if you want to raise your hand, that's another way to jump in if you have a clarifying question. If you have a bigger question, we can talk about it at the end.
Yes, absolutely. Great. So last piece of data, this is a lot of data that we use for this project, but this, I promise, last piece is data on schools and students. And this is, so we have information on student outcomes, which are going to be aggregated at the school level or school by cohort level, which come from a couple of different sources. So we have the share of undergraduate students in each cohort who eventually obtained a PhD, which we get from the survey of earned doctorates, which is the survey that the National Science Foundation runs every year, as a measure of, the kind of, future research output of the students that each school trains and educates. We have total patents produced by the students at each school, which come from the work of Chetty and co-authors combining patent data with tax records. We also have information on graduation rates from IPEDS, which is a large national survey of higher education institutions. We have measures of earnings of students after graduation, which primarily are going to come from the college scorecard database, which aggregates measures of earnings for each school and cohort of students 6 and 10 years after graduation. And we're also going to, in some tests, use measures of intergenerational mobility, say the probability that a child reaches the top quintile or top 20% of the income distribution, conditional on coming from a family on the bottom 20%. These are also going to come from the work of Chetty and co-authors. And then when we look at the correlation between the education innovation gap and these outcomes, we're going to try to control, as I said, for school characteristics. These are primarily going to come from IPEDS, this large national survey, and include things like the control, public versus private, the research intensity, financial variables such as expenditure and endowment, composition of the student body, composition of the faculty body. And we're also going to control for median parental income at each school, which again comes from tax data aggregated by Chetty and co-authors. All right, so what are we going to do with this data? The idea behind our methodology, our measure, is to use the content of a course to assess how much the knowledge contained in it is up to date. We want a syllabus to have a lower education innovation gap if it is more similar to newer research than it is to older one. Again, we're going to use a text as data approach. So we're going to use the text of each course syllabus, compare it with the text of papers published at different points in time. And we're going to construct the education innovation gap as the ratio between the similarity with older papers and the similarity with newer papers. How do we do this in practice? Let me walk you through the process that we follow. We start off from 2 sets of documents. We have the syllabi on one side and the academic publications on the other side. From these documents, we construct word vectors using a dictionary. So what this means in practice is that we consider a dictionary as a list of words. For the sake of today's presentation, we're going to use all the words that have ever been used as keywords in articles contained in Scopus, which is our database of publications that we use. And we're going to construct for each document a word vector of zeros and ones of the same length as the dictionary, whose elements are going to be equal to 1 if that particular document, a syllabus or a paper, contains a specific word in the dictionary and 0 otherwise. So basically, the vector for each document is going to tell us exactly what words that document contains. On top of everything, we're going to also apply a weighting procedure by which we're going to weight each element of the word vector corresponding to each word by the relative frequency in that particular document over the frequency of that particular word across all sets of documents. And we do this for 2 reasons, or actually for 3 reasons. The first one is we want to give more weight to words that are used more than once in a given document, because presumably they do a better job in capturing that particular document's content. Second, we want to downplay the weight of words that are used a lot across all documents, because those presumably are just, might just be words that are more frequently used in the English language, and that's why they're more likely just to be present in a given document. But also, we want to essentially make sure that we're not penalizing too much the syllabi for covering the classics. And the way that we do this is by thinking, okay, if a piece, if an article or a particular topic is a classic, then it's going to be more widely used across all documents. And because of that, the sort of total weight that we want to give to that word or to that particular term is going to be lower. Okay, so this weighting scheme also allows us to account for this issue of the classics a little bit. Once we have constructed these weighted word vectors, what we're going to do is we're going to construct a measure of textual similarity. That's going to be the cosine similarity. That's just a measure of distance between 2 vectors between each syllabus and each paper, with papers published at different points in time prior to the syllabus. And we're going to just construct the gap as the average similarity of a syllabus with all papers published 15 years prior to when the syllabus was taught over the average similarity with papers published the year prior to the syllabus. That's what we're going to do in practice. It's a process with many steps, but at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is quite simple. Okay. Just a simple example that kind of abstracts a little bit from this weighting technique, but sort of gives you the idea of what we're trying to do. Imagine we have 2 syllabi, each containing a set of words, syllabi taught at time t, so at the same time. And we have 2 papers. One of them is a relatively recent paper from last year, the paper Q, and the other one is paper R, is an older paper. And then we have a dictionary, which is just a list of words. We can see from the coloring that I have in this slide that syllabus A is equally similar to the 2 papers, whereas syllabus B has more green than it has red. So it is more similar to the newer paper than it is to the older paper. If we calculate the cosine similarities and then between the papers and the syllabi, and then the education innovation gap as I just defined it, we're going to find out that indeed the gap of syllabus B is going to be lower than the gap of syllabus A, exactly because of this relative similarity with papers published at different points in time. Okay, so there's a couple of things that we do. Yes. Yes.
Quick question. So this example, helpful example, is that these are sort of content words, but am I correct that you don't do any sort of screening of the words before you put them through this process, so that like author names that show up on a reading list would be examples of words that are used to make this?
So I am not sure who's talking. I apologize for that.
Eric Taylor. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, Alec. For some reason it didn't appear on my screen. So Eric. Basically, what I said here, so I mentioned this briefly here. So in step 1, actually, I mentioned this thing about the dictionary. So basically, the only terms that we're going to consider are the keywords in Scopus. So we do this exactly because we want to just capture the words that really convey content.
Great.
And ex ante, we strip punctuations and stop words. We make sure we're not picking up names. So we do some that cleaning at the beginning, but also the fact that we're using the dictionary, we define this in this way, makes us confident that we're only capturing kind of content or concept words.
Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
Thanks. Okay, so a couple of validation exercises that we do to make sure the gap is capturing what we want it to capture. Here, I'm just showing a bin scatter plot of the education innovation gap and the average reference age of each syllabus. This is basically the average age of all papers and books that are listed in the syllabus as required or recommended readings. So what this is telling us is that courses that reference older material also have a larger education innovation gap. Another thing that we do is a simulation exercise, and I mentioned this at the end. We take a sample of 100,000 syllabi, and we look into the syllabi for what we call old words, that is, words that are most commonly found in publications 15 years prior to the syllabus, and we replace them manually with words that are instead most likely to be found in recent papers published last year, what we call new words. And we start with, say, just one word, and then we replace 2 words, and then we replace more and more words, and we track on average what happens to the education innovation gap of this set of syllabi. We normalize the starting point here to 0, and what we see is that the gap progressively declines as we substitute old words with newer words. I'm going to come back to this figure in a few slides, because we think this figure is also kind of helpful to give an economic interpretation to differences in the gap. As you can see, the gap isn't just going to be a number that's going to be kind of hard to interpret, and the differences in the gap are also going to be a little bit hard to interpret. We think this figure is useful to economically quantify these differences.
Barbara, in this data set, don't you have like will you have a panel data for individual courses, for individual faculty? So even if you just did like a dissimilarity index over time, so just trying to check syllabi that change from year to year versus syllabi that are almost identical from year to year, like that would be another way to validate this measure, is like, do you see within person when they're changing their syllabus a lot from year to year, do you see an increase in or a decrease in the gap?
Yeah, we could try to do that. We are now exploring kind of different dimensions or different ways of quantifying the content of a course, or the way that the extent to which the content of a course changes over time. And this is definitely something we could do, but we haven't tried. We could try to do something like that. Although in a few slides, I'm going to show you that we actually try to track how the content of the same course changes over time, depending on who's teaching it. So I'm going to show you some of that. It's not the similarity index, it's still going to be our measure, but it's along the lines of what you were describing. Last thing I want to show you in terms of sort of validation exercise is just the average education innovation gap within course within field and year. So not comparing across fields and across years, just kind of within these categories across 3 course levels. We're going to have basic undergraduate, advanced undergraduate, and graduate courses. And what we're going to see, which we think is intuitive and sort of reassuring, is that the basic undergraduate courses have a larger gap. And this is consistent, I think, with people's priors, that more basic courses are more likely to teach, say, the classics or sort of the core of a discipline, compared, say, with PhD courses that are instead presumably supposed to expose students to really the frontier of knowledge. All right, so I'm going to spend most of the time that I have left, I think I have about 15 minutes, trying to explain how the gap varies both across and within schools. We're going to start with the, I just want to show you first kind of the distribution of this measure. So here, what we're doing is for the rest of the paper, we multiply our ratio of numbers that range between zeros and ones, because they represent similarities, by 100, just to make numbers easier to read. And you can see from this distribution that the average syllabus has a gap of about 95, which is a bit of a difficult number to interpret in itself, but it's basically telling us that the average syllabus is more similar to newer papers than it is to older ones on average. What we do next is a sort of decomposition of exercise using a Shapley decomposition. We look at different factors, different sets of fixed effects, and we try to understand how the kind of partial R squared adjusted R squared of our regression can be attributed to different factors. And you can focus on the second column. And what you can see here is that things like schools actually explain a relatively limited amount of variation between 2 and 3%, whereas instead it seems that instructors explain perhaps most of the variation in the gap. And so we're going to be focusing on these two dimensions, one because it's very important, and the other one because we think it's sort of intuitive to also look at it in the rest of the paper, but sort of having this kind of breakdown of the variation in mind. And in particular, we're going to start by looking at differences across schools. Specifically, we want to try and understand whether the average gap of a school, controlling, again, always for things like field, course level, and year effects, is associated with characteristics such as the organization or the control of the school, the focus, whether it's a teaching institution or a research institution, as well as resources. And we're also interested in trying to understand whether there is a pattern or a correlation between the types of the kind of population of students that each school enrolls and the average education innovation gap. We're going to do that in this chart here. So basically, each coefficient in this chart is the coefficient from a regression of the gap on indicators that I'm showing here on the vertical axis, controlling for field by course level by year effects. So what you can see is essentially that there are not a lot of differences in the gap between public and private schools, nor between liberal arts colleges and other schools. We have liberal arts colleges there because it was, it's a question that I always get when I present this paper. But we do see that the gap tends to be lower in schools, in so-called R1 schools. Those are schools of very high research intensity according to the Carnegie classification. We also see a negative correlation between the gap and measures of expenditure, especially instructional expenditure and research expenditure, and to some extent also endowment. So schools that are wealthier and spend more also tend to have more sort of up-to-date knowledge.
Barbara,
yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. There's a question in the chat about just how to interpret magnitudes here. Like, so just
give me one slide.
Okay, great.
One slide, then I'll go back to that. Let me just describe this last result here, because I think it's easier to talk about magnitudes when we look at this result. So what we do here, this last three coefficients that I'm showing here actually come from the same regression. So these are basically differences between each tier of selectivity. Ivy Plus and elite schools are, the Ivies Plus, Chicago, Stanford, Duke, and one other school that I'm blanking on. And other very selective schools. Then we have the highly selective schools and the selective schools. The omitted category is non-selective schools. So you should interpret these coefficients as the difference between each one of these selectivity tiers and non-selective schools. Again, question about the magnitude, how to interpret the magnitudes. We can go back to this graph here, and which basically tells us how a change in the gap, how say 0.5 change in the gap corresponds to a number of words that we would have to replace in a syllabus to generate that change. Okay, and so basically the simulation tells us that in order to close the gap that I showed you here between the Ivy Plus and elite schools and the non-selective schools, one would have to replace approximately 34 words in the median syllabus, which correspond to approximately 10% of the total content. So this is the way that throughout the paper we use to give an economic meaning to the differences in the gap. Okay. And then the last thing I want to talk about in terms of differences across schools is characteristics of the students. And we look at two sets of characteristics. The first one is the income of the parents, and the second one is the share of students who are who belong to a racial or ethnic minority. These are Black and Hispanic students. And what we do see is that schools that serve a larger share of students who are socioeconomically disadvantaged, so be it because their parental income is lower on average, or because they come from these underrepresented minority groups, tend to be exposed to courses with a larger gap, so less updated knowledge. Now, one thing that could be explaining this, or could be behind this this pattern, is the fact that might have to do with the ability of the students. So it could be the case, for example, that in order to absorb frontier knowledge, students have to be of higher ability ex ante. And this could also explain, for example, the pattern of selectivity that I showed at the beginning. And so it might simply be the case that schools that serve more disadvantaged students are also schools that tend to serve students with a lower level of ability, and are also schools that are trying to provide their students with the knowledge that they're able to absorb. However, what we try to do, whether this explanation has a bite, is to control for essentially the distribution of SAT or ACT scores of entering students in each school as a proxy for ability. And what we see is that even when we control for ability, things get a little bit more noisy because we are controlling for a lot of variables and we don't have a lot of power when it comes to the share of underrepresented minorities. But when you look at measures of parental income, you basically see that that correlation is robust. So it doesn't really seem like this result or these patterns are explained by differences in students' ability. Okay, it seems to be explained by other characteristics of the schools that determine the kind of segregation of schools across different types of institutions, serving, having different resources, and also offering different types of instruction.
Barbara, Peter Blair,
yes.
A quick question. So the point
yes.
estimate, once you control for SAT scores, looks very similar to the point estimate that you get for public, right? So I mean, like, should we be thinking about, in some sense, if you effectively, what I take away from this is that if you take like an HBCU and you give them like students with the same distribution of SAT scores, they look just like a public institution. And so effectively, these schools are just serving students from a different part of the ability distribution, or like the SAT score distribution.
I'm not sure I understand the question. Sorry, you cut off a little bit. So you're saying that
I was saying that
yeah.
Comparing the point estimates for the share minority students, once you control for the SAT scores, it looks very similar to the point estimates for the public. And so once you give these schools the same students from the same SAT score distribution, it seems like they're basically, they face the same innovation gap.
Yes, so I guess you're referring to the bottom coefficient, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's exactly the type of exercise that this thing would buy you, because there might be, there might be other differences across schools. I would have to think about it a little bit more carefully. This being said, these estimates are a little bit imprecise. So I would also maybe not make too much out of this comparison, because it's just, I think in my mind, a little bit hard to draw.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So the last few minutes, let me just tell you something instead about the instructors, which, as I showed you before in the composition table, are essentially the feature that explains most of the variation in the courses, even within schools. Another thing that comes out of this table from the first column is that courses, so course fixed effects, explain a lot of the variation over time, which is also telling us that there is quite a bit of persistence. This is sort of, kind of responding in part to Tom's question before, there is quite a bit of persistence in the content of the courses over time. So courses don't get updated every year, for example. So what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to better understand how the content of a given course evolves over time, and kind of relate that to the identity of the person who teaches it. And then we're going to check whether there are some characteristics of the instructor that predict the gap. So the first thing we're going to do is a simple event study around the point in time in which the instructor of a given course changes. And so what we want to see is whether there is some discontinuity around that point, or whether instead the gap looks a little bit more kind of smooth. And what we do see is a discontinuity here. So basically what this is telling us is that the gap is on a relatively sort of flat trend in the years leading to the change of an instructor, but then when a new person takes over the course, the gap tends to decrease. Okay, and things are not super precise because we don't have a lot of power given that we're looking at within course, but it does seem like the gap sort of stabilizes at that lower level. So what basically a way to interpret this is that faculty that have been teaching the same course over many years are not as likely to update the content, especially to update it in a direction of making the content closer to the research frontier, as it is the case for a new instructor taking over the course over someone else. Okay, because remember, this is within course, so it's literally the same course. So this is basically sort of helps us kind of characterize better the role of instructors, and B, also understand how the update of the content of the courses happens over time. And here I'm just highlighting kind of a breakdown across macro fields and also across course levels. And you can see that, if anything, this updating seems to be particularly pronounced for humanities and for graduate courses rather than courses in other fields or course levels. The other thing that we do is we try to understand whether there are characteristics of the instructors that predict the gap. And in particular, we're going to focus on research productivity. What we do here, I'm just showing sort of bin scatter plots controlling for field and course level. What we do see is a negative correlation between the gap and the publications of the instructors, the citations, to some extent also the receipt of grants, which makes us think that more kind of research active people also teach courses with a lower gap. One other pattern that we see in the data is that there's also a little bit of differences. We have much less data than we do in the other tests here, because this is only for kind of recent courses and in public institutions. But we do see, for example, that on average, adjunct and lecturers, which are the biggest non-ladder faculty group, tend to teach courses with the highest gap. And instead, assistant professors are the ones that seem to teach courses with the lowest gap. Part of this might be driven by the fact that assistant professors are also more likely to take over a new course from someone else and be in a position of sort of having to update it. In part, it could also be driven by the fact that assistant professors typically have, big incentives to be research active and to publish, which might make them more informed about where the frontier of knowledge really is. The last thing I want to mention about the instructors is sort of try to put, I'm sorry that I'm going a little bit fast, but I do want to leave some questions, some time for questions at the end. But we want to sort of put these results together to try and understand whether they can tell us something about how to best allocate instructors across courses, given that typically in a research university, a lot of faculty sometimes are seen as having two jobs that are competing with each other. One of them is to do research and the other one is to do teaching, and often they're seen as substitute. So some of the things that we see, which we think are interesting, I'm sorry that this is a big table with small numbers, but basically these are just regressions controlling of quantiles for publications and citations, having the education innovation gap as the outcome variable, controlling for field and also year effects. So this is really exploiting changes in the instructors over time. And what these regressions are telling us is that as I showed you before in the figures, instructors with publications or citations in the top quantiles have lower gaps. But this relationship seems to be particularly strong for some reason for the social sciences, but particularly for graduate courses. So it seems like sort of the importance of instructors' research productivity for the content of our education courses seems to be particularly pronounced for graduate courses, which is perhaps not surprising because those are the courses where you know, kind of a person's sort of research expertise can also be can come out more. Another thing which we were sort of curious about is whether there is a link between an instructor's research agenda and the topic of the course that they have to teach. The idea being that if you ask me to teach IO, I could probably teach it, but I would not be doing a good job in keeping the content updated as if you ask me to teach labor, just because my research is more focused on labor economics than it is on industrial organization. So what we do is we look at all courses in a given topic across all schools. We select the course with the lowest gap as sort of the gold standard for that particular course, and we calculate the cosine similarity between each instructor's publications and that one course. And that's our measure of fit between the research of the instructor and the topic of that course. And what we see is, again, a negative correlation between this measure of course fit and the education innovation gap. That is, if I'm teaching a course that's very close to what I'm interested in terms of research, I'm also going to do a better job. And here, for some reason, the correlation seems not to be as strong for graduate courses as it is for advanced courses. But this is just to show you how kind of things vary over time. Okay, so basically we sort of put these results together to kind of draw a picture of the role of instructors in determining the content of our education, and also to try and draw some lessons in terms of you know, perhaps the best allocation of instructors across courses. The last thing I want to mention, I want to talk about, and I'm going to be very fast in talking about this for the next couple of minutes, is the relationship between the education innovation gap and student outcomes. Essentially, the question that we're asking ourselves is, okay, we've documented all these differences across and within schools, across courses taught by different people. Do these differences matter for students, or, you know, it just so happens that courses differ in the content that they cover, but this doesn't seem to have big consequences on the students. Now, unfortunately, we don't have a credible research design that allows us to pin down causal relationships. So the best that we can do, given that for the sake of this project, we only have data aggregated at the school level, is to show you correlations between a set of student outcomes, such as you know, graduation rates, incomes, but also the number of patents and the share of students who complete a PhD. These are going to be the outcomes that we're going to be interested in. We're going to show these correlations sort of raw, but also controlling for a very large set of school observables to be able to compare as much as we can schools that look the same in terms of student composition, faculty composition, resources, endowment, as well as institutional characteristics like private versus public and the research focus. I'm listing essentially this very long list of observables here at the bottom of the slide. And just one small technical detail, which I'm also mentioning here, is that our gap is measured at the course level, whereas here the outcome data is at the school level. So what we basically do is we construct an average gap for each school, controlling for field by course level by year effects as just the school fixed effect of our regression of the gap on all these fixed effects, sort of like a school value added of the gap. So I'm just going to show you a set of graphs that depict these correlations, and then I will wrap up. So what you can see here is that there is a negative unconditional correlation, for example, between the gap and the share of students who complete a PhD program. That is pretty sizable in terms of magnitude, because of one standard deviation decline in the gap is associated with about a 17% increase in the share of students who finish a PhD. And this is also fairly robust, actually, when we control for this set of observables. So the magnitude of the correlation actually doesn't change. Same thing if we look at the total number of patents produced by students in a school and the average education innovation gap of the students that the students at that school are exposed to. We see that a 1 standard deviation decline in the gap is associated with 20% more patents, and this is also robust to controlling for this set of observables. Next thing we look at are graduation rates. This is unconditionally. You can see a very nice and neat negative correlation. This the magnitude is about 8% increase in graduation rates associated with a 1 standard deviation decline in the gap. This relationship becomes more smoothed. It's still statistically significant, but it's significantly smaller in magnitude when we do control for these observables. And the same thing happens if we look at incomes 10 years after graduation of the students. We see a negative unconditional correlation, which is about 7% increase in income associated with a 1 standard deviation decline in the gap. That, however, becomes a little bit more muted if we control for observables, indicating that part of the raw correlation is indeed explained by the observables, but at least not all of it. And I'm just gonna conclude because I want to leave at least a few minutes for questions. So just to summarize what we do, we construct this new measure aimed at capturing the extent to which the content of our education is similar to frontier knowledge. And then we try to describe this variation across and within schools. And we highlight a pretty large role for instructors, and in particular, we find that research productive instructors seem to be doing better in terms of covering this frontier knowledge. We also find a lot of differences, especially in access to low gap education across students with different backgrounds. And what we are doing now is trying to bring in individual level student data to try and establish a causal link essentially between this measure or the content of higher education and student outcomes, such as the choice of occupation, as well as things like earnings and employment, and so on. Thanks a lot.
So thank you, Barbara. So for folks who have questions, I see we have several people who have questions already. So why don't I start with, wait, I was misinterpreting the clapping from the hand raise. So if people have a question, please use the hand raise function.
And Tom, we do have a question from Twitter that I did put in the chat.
Okay. So one of the questions was, why not use the community college, data? Why drop the community colleges from the analysis?
So the answer is simple. The coverage of those types of schools was much poorer than it was from other schools, perhaps because of the difficulties that the open syllabus folks had in accessing those syllabi. So because we had few of them, it was much harder for us to understand patterns of selection into the sample. So we decided to drop them.
Great. Okay, so I see Peter has his hand up.
Yeah, first off, Barbara, thank you for a really terrific presentation. Could you tell us a little bit about what are some future things in this research agenda and what might be some other ways in which you think this really rich source of data and this novel measure that you've created can be used to improve the way that we think about efficiently providing innovative curricula?
So there's two sort of things that come to my mind. One, I was talking about it towards when I was wrapping up. So one of the things that we would like to do is establish a causal link between this kind of measure of innovation of the curriculum and student outcomes. And so what we're doing is we're restricting attention to a sample of schools for which we have students' transcripts. So we know which courses they took and we can link those with student outcomes. And so we can basically leverage differences in the education innovation gap coming from the fact that you took a course at a different point compared to me, and we had different professors, and we had different material for things that we might take as quasi-random. So that is the idea of that type of exercise. There is another line of research which is not just limited to kind of the innovation, the education innovation gap, but more broadly wants to use this sort of data. And in particular, this is like super early stage. We've just literally started to play around with the data. But one of the things that we would like to do is try to understand how increases in diversity of the faculty in terms of gender, race and ethnicity, nationality, and various types of dimensions. Also within different fields that historically have had different faculty compositions affects the content of education. Not just in terms of innovation, but also in terms of specific topics that get covered, specific teaching tools that get used, specific skills that are particularly trained. Think about soft skills, which have received a lot of attention. So this is another sort of strand of research, kind of sub-strand of research that we're planning to pursue.
Thank you.
Marty.
Yeah, so thanks, Barbara, for a fascinating presentation. It's a paper that to some degree is on innovation, but it's quite innovative in many ways itself. And since this is a seminar that's part of a doctoral training program, I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about how you thought about proceeding in this sort of quite new area, both for you and for the field. It strikes me that there was a lot of, work. There are lots of ways in which this project that would involve a ton of work to assemble the data might not have worked out. You might not have been able to develop a measure that seemed to be valid in capturing what you were trying to get at. Once it was developed, it might not have correlated in any way with the types of things that you showed us that it does, which in some cases, a null finding would be a useful result, but with a new measure, maybe not as much. And so I'm just curious, how did you think about the decision to undertake this line of research? And what did you do along the way to sort of make sure that it wasn't something that wasn't worth pursuing and maybe you just want to fail fast and go in a different direction?
Yeah, this is a great question. And it's actually, I mentioned this to someone today, maybe it was to Eric, but this paper, this idea was basically born out of a conversation that I was having with my co-author, who's also my colleague at a business school. And so we were sort of kind of chatting about the future of MBAs and whether MBAs are really a bubble or whether we're actually teaching something meaningful to our students. And we decided to, do a little bit more work in trying to figure out how the content of the courses that we teach has evolved over time. And then we basically discovered this source of data. So this is, it's not something that in my relatively short career has happened to me a lot, but it's an example of a project that was actually, it was born with an idea, but then the direction in which it went depended a lot on the type of data that we found. So we found this rich text data and we decided to start analyzing it. I remember that, at the beginning, we just focused on the cosine similarity between the articles and the new papers, but then we realized there were drawbacks to that measure because it could be, dependent a lot on the style of a syllabus, and different syllabi have different styles, whereas working with a ratio allows us to kind of have those things cancel out. So we had to do some refinements. And then I guess it was also a high risk project, which sometimes makes sense to pursue in at other stages, maybe makes less sense, but it involved some risk in the sense that it took a little time for us to be able to actually work with the data because it was a large amount of text. And so it took us a little while to understand how to process it. There were different kind of cleaning steps that we had to complete. And then eventually when we did, we actually got something that kind of correlated with things in a way that seemed intuitive or that allowed us to tell a story. Of course, not everything made sense the first time we looked at it, which I guess is common. But at least at the first pass, we sort of realized that we had been successful in trying to capture the kind of dimension that we had in our mind. But it did take some adjustments. So it's not like we tried. We had the idea immediately about this ratio measure, and then the first time that we tried it, it worked out. So it did take some adjustment. But it's an example of a project that was a little bit born in part with the data.
And those same data could be used even as an outcome variable for like an information experiment where you're sending information to faculty and see what kinds of,
whether they react. Yeah,
whether prompts produce changes in syllabi.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hey, I noticed you haven't updated your syllabus in 5 years. Like, does that provoke any changes? Okay, Matt.
Hi, thank you for this really exciting research that you shared. Given the lag from manuscript to publication, the incentives that faculty place on publication, and the sort of proliferation of working papers and gray literature and preprints, how are you thinking about those non-peer reviewed publications as inputs into your model?
So it's a good question. I think that so to some extent, we are capturing those when we are trying to measure instructors' productivity because we're using Microsoft Academic, but it is true that we are not whenever we are trying to determine what the frontier of knowledge is. And there are fields where working papers are not that much of a thing because people are very much afraid of plagiarism or sort of being scooped. That's not the case, for example, for economics. I think working papers stay around for a couple of years before they get published usually, and they often in this process make it to the syllabi. I myself teach working papers, so it basically it undermines the ability of our measure to capture the frontier of knowledge if we're lagging a little bit, especially if the publication process, as it is in economics, is a little bit long, which is, I guess, another reason why we look at things within fields. So we never try to compare the gap of two courses in the same school, in the same course level, but in two different fields, just because we want to acknowledge the fact that the publication process is different. And so the way that our measure is going to be constructed and reflect from is also inevitably going to differ.
Okay, well, I just wanted to, in wrapping up, thank Barbara again for joining us. And
thank you.
Let's do use the Zoom clapping. But also I wanted to announce that the next PIER seminar is going to be March 8th. With Christina Weiland from University of Michigan. So look forward to seeing you all in a month, and thanks, Barbara. I think that the PIER fellows should